Hi, welcome back to myself, Steve Hayes, and my colleague Michael Darby from Element as we catch up and do a roundup on the things and hot topics that have been going on in the industry over the last couple of months or so since our last video. We're going to have a run through on a lot of the hot topics that we've been talking about in the industry itself, and then have a forward look as to what's coming up over the next couple of months or so before our next video just after the summer. So I think when we did our last video, we had a lot of our industry meetings ahead of us. So the US TCB Council and the EUAMB, the REDCA, and some of the trade association meetings as well. So let's get straight into it. And Michael, perhaps you can give us an update on the TCB Council meetings that took place, during May, I think it was.
Actually, end of April. Thank you very much, Steve. Yeah, so TCB Council workshop was the end of April 2022. It's a 3-day event, 4-day if you include a kind of basic foundations day. It was online, hopefully the last version that would be all online. But it was a good day, a good week, useful information. Some of the hot topics really, nothing staggering and new, but some of the hot topics would be the RF exposure rule change. So many of you may know that in May 2021, the FCC published some new rules for RF exposure. Industry has sort of taken note of that, has been largely waiting for the guidance that will tell us how to implement these. That guidance has been issued in a draft format and was supposed to have come into force several months ago, and then it was delayed and delayed again. And in fact, at the TCB Council workshop, we were told that the new rules guidance would come into force on the 30th of June 2022, and then we've just learnt this week that it's been extended another month to the end of July 2022. We'll let you know if that gets extended again. So what important things will that change for us? Well, the FCC have always said that RF exposure must be assessed for any type of transmitter. It's not been in the rules, it's been in a guidance document. But now the rules make it clear that every type of transmitter must have an RF exposure assessment. A lot of things have always had them, cell phones, Wi-Fi, things like that, Bluetooth. They've always required an RF exposure assessment. I think I mentioned in our last video that there'd be some high power transmitters that will be a bit of a shock for them, but also the low power transmitters like a car key fob or an RFID thing. And I think it's going to be a little bit tricky for those manufacturers, and one of the big questions we had for the FCC was, for a portable or body-worn, very low power, low frequency device, how is the manufacturer expected to show that they understand what their output power is? Because sometimes the field strength of those devices is very low and we dismiss them as being harmless, but the actual transmitter power can be quite high and the efficiency of the antenna is poor enough that the field strength is low. But from an RF exposure point of view on a body worn or carried in your hand or pocket product, it's the conducted actual transmitter power that's important. And the FCC really reiterated their point that the manufacturer is expected to understand exactly what their transmitter power is. I know a lot of manufacturers are going to struggle with that, and the FCC's response really was, well, you either figure it out or you can do a SAR test if you prefer. Another important topic that got discussed was RF exposure from what the FCC referred to as the unintentional radiator. This is the EMC emissions, all of the non-transmitter stuff, power supply noise, processor clocks, spurious emissions that we would normally do in an EMC test. You now have to demonstrate that those things will pass the RF exposure. So for example, if you were to take all of your spurious emissions and assess them as a percentage of the RF exposure rules, if the total contribution of your spurious emissions to RF exposure is less than 10% of the RF exposure limits, then you could say, well, the contribution's negligible. If the contribution is more than 10% of the RF exposure rules, then you're supposed to add them to the transmitter RF exposure contribution. This is quite a big deal actually, because at a time when transmitter manufacturers are playing with things like time average SAR to get their power levels perfectly tuned to the SAR limits, now to have to consider the emissions level contribution is quite a big deal. And you could have manufacturers saying, well, if we can fix our EMC emissions, we'll be able to have a bit more transmitter performance. So this is a new thing. And actually, as the TCB Council, there's a small committee of us that are in communication with the FCC to really make sure that this is done in a practical way that's useful and satisfies the requirement, but doesn't impact industry more than is necessary. Another important topic was raised by the FCC was antenna gain. For as long as I've been testing radios, the basic concept has been if you want to measure the EIRP of a signal, you could measure the conducted transmitter power or conducted value of a signal, and then add an antenna gain, and that would give you like an EIRP or ERP value. And the FCC have said, well, that's fine for a standalone antenna, but an antenna installed onto a product or perhaps inside a product, it could affect the antenna performance. And they made a almost sweeping statement really that when you install an antenna into a product, you shouldn't be using the declared antenna gain, you should be measuring the actual antenna gain. Great news for Element's OTA labs, you might think, but this is really quite a big deal for the industry. And so again, as the TCB Council, we are in communication with the FCC to say, look, is this really a practical thing here? We want to make sure that the values measured are accurate, but let's make sure that we're not making a big deal to solve really quite a small problem. So these are ongoing topics at the moment. Another thing that was discussed mostly by Canada was the issue of a family certification. Canada and the USA, really, they talk about if you want to test one product and certify or approve multiple products, then those products really have to be identical. But over the years, manufacturers have kind of misunderstood that a little bit, and they've said, well, I've got 5 products here, they're mostly similar, maybe some minor hardware variations. I'm going to test the one that I think is the worst case, and then I want to authorize or approve all the other 4 based on the testing of the one that I think is the worst case. Manufacturers do this, and some TCBs don't understand that that's wrong, and a lot of manufacturers don't understand that if you haven't tested the technical variants or the hardware variants, they're not legally authorized. And so there was a lot of discussion on that, and you can contact us if you'd like some more information. Finally, another thing that wasn't really discussed too much at the TCB Council workshop, but it is a big deal for the FCC, is the possible introduction of receiver assessments. When the FCC wrote their rules many years ago, I think the original sort of trigger point for the FCC rules was back in 1910 with regard to ship-to-ship or ship-to-land communications, and you wouldn't want interference there because you want to make sure your signals get through. Well, nowadays, of course, you walk around your home or your city and there's radio communication everywhere. In Europe, we understand that, and we have radio receiver performance, and that's a really big part of the Radio Equipment Directive and has been since 2016. The FCC are now realizing that the receiver performance is a critical part, spectrum sharing and radio planning. So I think we can see that coming to the FCC soon. It's at a notice of inquiry stage at the moment, but in my opinion, this isn't going to be shall we do it or not. This is more like how shall we do it. Okay, so those were the most exciting points from my point of view from the TCB Council workshop. Most of the other time was spent telling labs, manufacturers and even TCBs of some of the common mistakes they've been making. So the next meeting on our calendar was the EUAMB. This is the notified body group for the EMC directive in Europe. And Steve, you were there at those meetings, I believe. Tell us what happened.
Great, thank you, Michael. Yeah, so EUAMB is actually a small meeting compared to the REDCA, just simply by virtue of the fact that more products these days are fitted with some form of wireless technology and therefore fall under the radio directive as opposed to just the EMC directive. So the meeting itself started with a review of, or a presentation I should say, from a external consultancy who was appointed by the Commission to review the EMC directive and almost do a state of the nation type of assessment to say, is it fit for purpose? Is it too onerous? Is it not onerous enough? And so they presented the output from the review that they did, which included talking to industry groups, all stakeholders really, right from test organisations through to regulators, manufacturers, enforcement authorities, really to get that feedback as to whether the directive itself was needed changing or was perfectly adequate as it was. So those conclusions were presented and have been fed back to the Commission now to see what they want to do with it. On the whole, the summary was actually it's about right. I think there was quite a lot of feedback from manufacturers and maybe test organisations about the lack of harmonised standards that have been published, and we've covered that in previous videos. But on the whole, you know, as Michael was referring to a few minutes ago, do we actually need to do not just emissions testing, so what the product has emitted, but immunity, how immune it is to the electromagnetic environment? And actually the conclusion is it's the combination of those two things that stops harmful interference. Just doing emissions testing doesn't necessarily get us to that point. So that was a good topic. We reviewed the TGNs, and again, like the REDCA, the EUAMB has a series of TGNs, technical guidance notes, which were intended originally for notified bodies, but actually they're posted in a public forum that allows manufacturers to also review those documents. And we noted that there was many of them that were now out of date because of the good work that the association's done. The information's been fed back to the standards writers, and many of the issues covered in the TGNs have now been reflected in some updated standards themselves. There was an update from the ESOs, the European Standards Organisations that write the standards. So predominantly for the EMC directive, that is CENELEC. But also ETSI contribute a few standards to the EMC directive as well. So we reviewed those, and of course the reoccurring theme, which again we sort of touched on in previous videos, is the fact that many of the standards which are published haven't made it through to the official journal and therefore considered as harmonised. And we talked around the reasons for those. And what's going to be done about it. And actually CENELEC TC210, who are the EMC body that write EMC standards, predominantly for the EMC directive, they actually had their most recent meeting just last week actually, and had a number of actions to resolve some of these issues. Early engagement with the consultants that the Commission use, dialogue much earlier in the process with both the consultant and the Commission itself, to make sure that no roadblocks when standards are published, that they would see no reason why they wouldn't be listed as harmonised. Yeah, so one of the last things that we talked about at the EUAMB meeting was ADCO. So there's an ADCO for each of the different CE marking directives. This one is specific to EMC. And we got an update on a number of the different regulatory and market surveillance enforcement actions that have been taken, and also a forward look as to what are the high risk items or the product groups that have seen high areas of non-compliance or interference over the last 12 months or so. And so we got a window into the future campaigns for this year, which include replacement fluorescent tubes, which are predominantly now LED based. So there's an area that some of the surveillance campaigns are going to be focused on. And then also kitchen appliances. The amount of technology that's packed into your what were traditionally relatively basic electrical goods in your kitchen, largely now microprocessor based, radio technologies in as well. So that's another area for the market surveillance to concentrate and do their work on over the next 12 months or so. So we had a relatively short meeting actually for the EUAMB, which actually worked out very nicely because it often coincides with the REDCA. And I think, Michael, you're going to give us an update on the REDCA itself and the meeting. Yeah, I'll maybe hand over to you and you can give us an update.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, so the REDCA, this is the notified body group for the Radio Equipment Directive. We met in May 2022 and again, online meeting, but hoping to meet in person next time. So firstly, a technical guidance note that I've been working on risk assessments. That finally got published. We've been working on it for a while. It's actually quite an old document. It's been published in a version 1 for some time. We've been working on an update. Hopefully this is a useful update. We've changed some of the text and we've added a kind of informative annex, which is a bit like a checklist. Obviously, each manufacturer is responsible for creating their own risk assessment, and there isn't a formal checklist format, but hopefully this technical guidance note, as the name suggests, provides some good guidance for them. As a reminder, this whole risk assessment thing, this isn't like to be confused with a safety risk assessment where you're thinking, what is the hazard? What's the likelihood of it happening? Am I in a red box, orange box, green box kind of thing? This is more like a compliance risk assessment where you'd look through your whole journey of your product development from sort of R&D stage to placing on the market, where you'd say, okay, can I even use this product in the EU? What standards must I apply? How must I test it? Or how do I think I should test it? How is my customer likely to use it? How might they use it that I hadn't really thought about? What sort of temperature range will it be used under? How are people going to plug it in? Are they going to carry it? All those sorts of things. The analogy I like to use is, it's like you're leaving the house and you get to the front door and you say to yourself, did I turn the oven off? Did I feed the cat? Did I close the windows? Have I done everything? Is there anything I haven't thought of? That's the kind of approach of the risk assessments for the Radio Equipment Directive. And so this technical guidance note, known as TGN 30, provides guidance. It's written for notified bodies, but we know it will be viewed by notified bodies, consultants, test labs, and manufacturers. Now, since the REDCA meeting, actually a working group within ETSI has been set up to write a technical report on risk assessment. So that will be a guidance document. And you may say, well, if we've got the TGN 30, why do we also need an ETSI document? Well, I think it will just be useful to get the information to a wider audience. There's a lot of people in the world who know about ETSI technical documents, and they don't necessarily know about the REDCA TGNs. So I think it will be a good thing to have this ETSI document, and Steve and I are both contributors to that document. Other things that are happening, there's the cybersecurity topic. Now, this has been a big thing, of course. The European Commission published their Commission decision on cybersecurity at the beginning of 2022. They've laid out basically the type of equipment that will be covered and the reason for covering it. So anything that can be connected to the internet, either directly or indirectly, will be within the scope of these cybersecurity requirements. There are a couple of exclusions, like types of product where they've got cyber covered under other regulations. For example, type approved automobiles or medical devices. But for the most part, if it's a radio product that can connect directly or indirectly to the internet, or perhaps it is to be used by a child, or maybe contains some sort of personal or private data of a person, then it's going to come under the scope of these cyber security requirements.
Just while you're talking about that, I think it's quite interesting talking about cybersecurity as well in the context of the radio directive, because it might be that some notified bodies don't necessarily have expertise in all areas required by the directive itself.
Yeah.
and there was an issue or topic that came up about using multiple notified bodies. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that and whether it's okay or not.
Yeah, good point, Steve. So originally, the European Commission had said one notified body must take responsibility for the whole compliance, and the manufacturer's DOC should only reference one notified body. So for example, if you already had a notified body assessment for EMC and radio, and then later you wanted to go to a notified body for the cyber part, then that notified body, the new notified body, would have to recheck that everything was still valid. And it made perfect sense. But actually at the REDCA, the European Commission clarified that there's no need to do that. And in fact, you can use multiple notified bodies for different aspects. So for example, you could have a notified body give a type examination certificate for the radio performance, Article 3.2. And then you could have a different notified body issue a certificate for the cyber requirements, Article 3.3. And then, for example, if it's a cell phone, another notified body could issue a type examination certificate for the emergency calling requirements, also in Article 3.3. And then the manufacturer's declaration of conformity in this example would end up listing all three of the notified bodies and all three of the certificate numbers. So yeah, that is okay to do that now.
Great.
So other meetings that have been happening, I guess the next meeting after that was the EMC Test Lab Association. Now the EMC Test Lab Association is based in the UK, but it is an international association. We have members around the world, and it's founded by EMC Test Labs, but it's also attended by, well, I say EMC, of course, EMC, radio, safety and compliance, but also manufacturers and consultants attend. It just so happens that at this time I am the technical secretary of that group and Steve is the chairman of that group. So I'll let Steve tell you a little bit about what happened in our last meetings.
Great, thank you, Michael. Yeah, and actually the EMCTLA largely covered many of the same topics as both the EUAMB and the REDCA touched on. Michael gave some presentations from TCB Council in terms of updates as to what's happening in North America as well. And probably it'd be fair to say that the EMCTLA is more focused at the testing side, the practical side, rather than the certification side. Just on that point, notified bodies actually, for all of the directives, but specifically EMC and radio here, have just been reminded not to try and advertise or portray the fact, come test with us because we're a notified body. And it's really just a reminder to say, a test lab has got nothing to do with a notified body. So don't get confused between the two things. A test lab does the testing. Their independence, technical competence and partiality is governed by the international standard 17025. A notified body on paper has nothing to do with the testing aspects. Their impartiality is governed by 17065. So don't get confused between the two things. You have to make sure that you separate certification activities away from testing activities. So going back to the testing itself and the EMCTLA meeting, we talk a lot about changes coming along in standards. Standards really divided into product family standards and then basic standards, so the nuts and bolts of how you do things. So we noted that because of a number of different technologies, there's a lot of development of standards below 30 megahertz. So radiated emission testing below 30 megahertz, predominantly driven by technologies like wireless power transfer. But when we start opening up that can of worms, then we identify the fact that we don't have calibration methods for loop antennas, which are used below 30 megahertz. We don't have calibration methods for calibrating the environment itself, so the equivalent of a normalized site attenuation or NSA type of assessment, and then really firming up on the actual test methods below 30 megahertz as well. So we got into a good level of discussion about those sorts of things. Changes to other product standards coming along. So we looked at CISPA 11, for example. We looked at CISPA 32 for multimedia products. CISPA 14-1 for household products, 15 for lighting. And we had a good review on the changes coming along, for which there were actually quite a lot. Not many standards have been published over the last couple of years, predominantly because actually of COVID and the lack of face-to-face meetings, which has seemed really to slow up a number of things. That in itself has reminded me, we have the CISPA plenary meetings scheduled for the end of October, beginning of November this year. Element is one of the proud sponsors or the prime sponsor for the CISPA meetings this year, which will take place in San Francisco. So very much looking forward to those meetings. And whenever there is plenary meetings, the working groups where the real work is done typically have their meetings at the same time. And in a run-up to these meetings, there's normally a bit of a frenzy of activity in terms of new items to be discussed and resolved. So anybody that's involved in that whole concept of reality to or R&D and to reality really should be looking out for these sorts of things, because they are going to be hot topics and things that we talk about in our future videos. Other topics for EMCTLA, we talked about some of the ETSI standards which are changing and some of the issues related to that. And then more of a national interest was the UKCA marking and the designation of standards. So in the UK they have designated standards, which are the equivalent of harmonised standards under CE marking. And we noted that at that time, so during May, that they hadn't really had many designated standards being listed. Now there was an updated list at the end of May for a number of the different regulations that we have in the UK: radio, EMC, safety, so the equivalent of the low voltage directive, general product safety directive. So a number of new listings have come out for designated standards in the UK. The key takeaway for me is actually we're now starting to see some divergence between the European harmonised standards and the UK designated standards. And that's a really important thing for manufacturers to be aware of, because you don't want to be caught out by testing to the wrong version of a standard. That's not to say it's wrong, but it may require some additional explanation as to what standard you've used and why you've actually used it. I guess that in itself brings us on to talking about wider topics. Michael talked about the REDCA TGN 30 and the wider topic being risk itself. I think we've talked about it previously, and I'm not going to ask for apology that we're going to carry on talking about it, because it's one of those topics that is emerging as we move into a more risk-based society. We talked about the fact that Michael and I on this ETSI group helping to write a TR, technical report on risk analysis as applied to radio equipment for both EMC and radio characteristics. And I really encourage you to try and follow that closely, because it's really important, and it identifies and tries to get manufacturers to think about topics in a wider context than harmonised standards can typically do. And what I mean by that, just to sort of whet your appetite, I guess, is you'll find that in many ETSI standards these days, for example, we say this is the test, and you would do it at normal ambient conditions. What you need to think about as a manufacturer is, well, my product is portable. It's designed to be used in the extreme northern hemisphere or extreme southern hemisphere outside. So should you be thinking about doing temperature extreme testing? Because we know, certainly in the case of microprocessors and radio RF based equipment, that if you start changing the temperature, then you start adjusting, or have the ability of start adjusting the stability of the device, which could mean drift off frequency or changes to the output power or amplitude of some of these things. So that's just the sort of thing that we're starting to think about in many of these risk-based forums that we're talking to. While we're talking about risk as well, we've got some updated medical standards. The medical standards, so for EMC, 60601 is the whole medical series of standards. -1, -2 is the EMC specific requirements of medical devices. Now, it's a little bit confusing, and I shouldn't really say it's the EMC standard for medical devices, because actually it's the electromagnetic disturbance or safety standard for medical devices. We're now starting to call it EMC resilience as opposed to EMC compatibility. We have an amended standard, -1, -2, that came out just a few years ago now. It's been adopted in Europe for a little while. The FDA have recently acknowledged it as a consensus standard, which means that manufacturers can use that for submission or demonstration of compliance to the FDA requirements in the US. And really, if Europe has adopted it and the FDA in the US has adopted it, then the writing's on the wall in terms of timeline for other countries to recognise those standards as well. And fundamentally, the amendment integrates some of the wireless coexistence testing that we used to do to separate standards. So really looking at making sure that RFID or high power transmitters don't start interfering with your particular type of medical device. So watch out for that, because that's an important change that is sort of now doing the rounds and will become a mandatory requirement in quite short order now. Okay, thanks for tuning in. We're going to wrap up now. Apologies, it's been a slightly longer video than we had anticipated, but really that's a sort of indication of the amount of stuff that's actually going on in the industry at the moment. As we come out of COVID, people are dusting down all of the great ideas that they've had and start to really think about the future. And so, yeah, we've today been talking about TCB, REDCA, EUAMB, Test Labs Association, UKCA marking, CE marking, FCC marking. So there's been quite a lot in there. We hope you found it useful. I enjoyed doing it, so thank you very much, Michael.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. As Steve said, it is a longer video than normal, but thanks to those who stuck with it. It would have been hard to know what to take out. It could have been 4 times longer. There's so much information. Please do get in touch with Steve or myself or any Element representative if you have any questions about things we've talked about today.
And then in terms of looking forward to the future, obviously we're doing another video next couple of months or so. Let's have a think about what's coming up. So we've got a relatively quiet period over the summer months, so July and August, and then September it all starts again. I guess we've got, when's TCB Council?
Next TCB Council will be in October, and then the next REDCA will be next November. Next EMCTLA December, so take the summer off, Steve, I think.
Yeah, right. We've got the CISPRA meetings, actually it's the week before the REDCA, so that's end of October. That will go straight into REDCA and EUAMB, as you mentioned there. So
Element are hosting a live training seminar at one of our radio labs in the UK, and I'll put out a separate video to describe the agenda for that. But that'll be the 13th of July. We're going to go all through radio approvals, integration of modules, risk assessments, and mixing of the various regulations.
Yeah, and then just thinking about what we're going to do over the summer, apart from taking a vacation, will be we've got the TGN on vehicles, so hopefully we'll get that down on paper and we'll be reviewing that in the fall of this year. What else was there? Oh, the ETSI stuff that we talked about on risk. So we just recently had a meeting with the ETSI group on that, and I think Michael, you and I have both got some actions to input some more material for that, and so hopefully we should see some drafts coming out probably the other side of the summer now, but pen to paper time over the summer months.
Yeah, and I've got some actions to help update some FCC KDBs. So busy time in between meetings.
Great stuff. So thanks again for tuning in, and look forward to updating you in the next couple of months. Let's see how we get on from there.
Cheers.
Thanks again. Cheers.